Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A marriage of opposites. Have you ever looked at someone you love and secretly wondered, how are we even still together? If you are struggling with English, feeling stuck in life, or wondering whether two completely different people can truly build a happy future, this story may surprise you. In today's slow English reading practice, I will share my personal story about love, marriage, family life in the United States, and how my husband and I survived years of disagreements about almost everything. What started as a relationship filled with frustration, confusion, and constant arguments eventually became the strongest part of my life. The strange part is that nothing changed overnight. There was no magic solution. There was only a series of small moments that taught us lessons we never expected to learn. My name is Emily, and I live in the United States with my husband and our children. If you met us today, you might think we are a normal happy family. We laugh together, make plans together, and enjoy many simple moments together. But if you had met us years ago, you might have predicted that our marriage would never survive. The truth is almost funny now. My husband and I disagreed about nearly everything. I am naturally organized. I like schedules, lists, and plans. I enjoy knowing what will happen tomorrow, next week, and even next month. My husband is completely different. He likes spontaneity. He believes that some of the best things in life happen when there is no plan at all. I would carefully prepare for a weekend trip 3 weeks in advance. He would pack his bag 30 minutes before leaving. I like quiet evenings at home. He loves social events and meeting new people. I prefer saving money for the future. He believes experiences are worth spending money on today. I enjoy reading books. He enjoys outdoor adventures. Even our opinions about the weather were different. When winter arrived, I wanted warm blankets and hot tea. He wanted to go outside and enjoy the cold air. At first, these differences seemed exciting. Many people experience this in relationships. Psychologists often describe a phenomenon called novelty attraction. When we meet someone different from ourselves, our brains become curious. New experiences activate reward systems in the brain and create feelings of excitement. In simple words, our differences made us interesting to each other. When we first met, I admired his confidence. He admired my reliability. I thought he made life more exciting. He thought I brought stability into his life. Everything felt balanced. But there is something nobody tells you about relationships. The same qualities that attract you in the beginning can become the qualities that frustrate you later. The confidence I loved sometimes looked like stubbornness. The spontaneity I admired sometimes looked irresponsible. Meanwhile, my reliability looked controlling from his perspective. My careful planning sometimes felt restrictive to him. At the beginning of our relationship, these issues were small. We could laugh about them. We would joke about how different we were. Friends often laughed too. "You two are complete opposites," they would say. We always smiled and answered the same way. Maybe that's why it works. At the time, we genuinely believed that. Then life became more serious. Our relationship moved beyond dates and weekend activities. We started discussing bigger topics. We talked about careers, finances, family traditions, future children, and where we wanted to live. That was when the real challenges appeared. One evening, we sat together at a small restaurant after work. What started as a simple conversation turned into a long debate. We were discussing future goals. I wanted security. He wanted flexibility. I wanted detailed plans. He wanted freedom. Neither of us was trying to hurt the other person. Neither of us was angry. But neither of us could understand why the other person thought differently. That moment taught me something important. Most relationship conflicts do not begin because people are bad. They begin because people see the world through different lenses. Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of the same mountain. Both describe what they see honestly. Both descriptions are true. Yet the views are completely different. That was us. As our relationship continued, these differences followed us everywhere. When we talked about money, we disagreed. When we talked about vacations, we disagreed. When we talked about daily routines, we disagreed. Even simple decisions sometimes became surprisingly difficult. Looking back now, I can laugh about some of those moments. At the time, however, they felt exhausting. Research from marriage experts has shown that many long-term couples never fully eliminate their differences. In fact, some studies suggest that a large percentage of recurring marital conflicts are never completely solved. Instead, successful couples learn how to manage those differences in healthy ways. I did not know that back then. I thought happy couples agreed on everything. I thought strong marriages had very few conflicts. I thought compatibility meant thinking the same way. Life would eventually teach me how wrong I was. There was another challenge too. We were building our lives in the United States, where work schedules were demanding, living expenses were rising, and daily responsibilities seemed endless. Modern American family life often requires constant balancing between career goals, financial planning, relationships, and personal well-being. Some days felt like a race. Wake up. Go to work. Handle responsibilities. Come home tired. Repeat. When stress increased, our differences felt even bigger. Small disagreements became larger discussions. Larger discussions sometimes became arguments. And every argument seemed to raise the same question. Can two people who disagree about so much really build a lasting marriage? At that point in my life, I honestly did not know the answer. If someone had shown me a picture of our future family, I might not have believed it. If someone had told me that one day these same differences would actually strengthen our relationship, I would have laughed. Yet life has a strange way of teaching lessons when we least expect them. The journey ahead would challenge both of us. It would test our patience, our communication, and our understanding of love itself. There would be moments of frustration, moments of doubt, and moments when giving up seemed easier than continuing. But there would also be unexpected discoveries. And the first discovery was this. Sometimes the biggest problem in a marriage is not the disagreement itself. Sometimes the biggest problem is believing that disagreement means failure. That simple lesson would become the beginning of a story neither of us could have predicted. Our first big differences. Have you ever noticed how two people can fall deeply in love before realizing they are reading completely different maps for the same journey? That was exactly what happened to me. During the early months of our relationship, everything felt exciting. We were discovering new places, sharing stories, and learning about each other. The differences that seemed charming at first slowly began revealing themselves in ways neither of us expected. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs clearly. At the time, however, I thought every disagreement was just a small bump on the road. What I did not realize was that those small bumps were quietly preparing us for much larger challenges ahead. One of our first major differences appeared during the holiday season. Family traditions are powerful things. Many people do not think about them because they grow up surrounded by them. Traditions become invisible. They feel normal. My family believed holidays should be carefully planned. We created schedules, organized meals, invited relatives weeks in advance, and followed familiar routines. My husband's family was the opposite. Their gatherings were flexible, spontaneous, and often changed at the last minute. One Thanksgiving became our first real test. I spent days preparing. I made lists, organized food, and arranged every detail. Then my husband casually suggested inviting several extra guests the day before the celebration. To him, it seemed friendly and welcoming. To me, it felt like chaos. I remember staring at him in disbelief. He looked equally confused by my reaction. Neither of us understood why the other person was upset. That moment introduced us to an important reality about relationships. We often assume our habits are logical while viewing someone else's habits as strange. Psychologists call this the false consensus effect. People naturally believe their way of thinking is more common than it actually is. When someone behaves differently, the brain sometimes interprets it as wrong instead of simply different. This psychological tendency creates countless misunderstandings in relationships. Our conversations became longer. Sometimes they became debates. We were not discussing major political issues or life-changing decisions. We were discussing everyday situations. Yet those situations exposed deeper values hidden underneath. I valued structure because it made me feel secure. My husband valued flexibility because it made him feel free. Neither value was bad. The problem was that we were trying to prove which one was better. Another challenge appeared when we started talking seriously about money. Money is one of the most common sources of conflict in marriages across the United States. Financial experts frequently report that disagreements about spending and saving create significant stress for many couples. We quickly discovered why. I believed financial security created peace of mind. I liked budgeting, tracking expenses, and building savings. My husband saw money differently. He believed money should help create memorable experiences. He enjoyed traveling, trying new activities, and occasionally making spontaneous purchases. One Saturday afternoon perfectly captured our differences. We were walking through a shopping district when he suggested booking a short weekend getaway. The idea sounded fun, but I immediately started calculating costs in my head. Hotel expenses, transportation, food, unexpected costs. My excitement disappeared as my brain transformed into a financial calculator. Meanwhile, he was already imagining beautiful scenery and fun memories. The conversation quickly became another disagreement. What fascinated me later was that we were both trying to create happiness. We simply defined happiness differently. I associated happiness with stability. He associated happiness with adventure. The conflict was not about money. The conflict was about values. Understanding this distinction would become one of the most important lessons of our marriage. Around the same time, another difference surfaced. Our communication styles were dramatically different. When I faced a problem, I wanted to discuss it immediately. I believed conversations solved problems. My husband preferred time to think before talking. He often needed space to process emotions privately. Imagine two people trying to open a locked door using opposite methods. One pushes harder. The other pulls harder. Neither realizes the door requires a different approach entirely. That was often our situation. When I wanted to talk, he wanted time alone. When he finally felt ready to talk, I sometimes felt emotionally exhausted. Research in relationship psychology shows that communication differences often create misunderstanding even when both partners have good intentions. The issue is not necessarily what people say. The issue is often timing, expectations, and emotional processing styles. Unfortunately, we had not learned that lesson yet. Every disagreement felt personal. Every misunderstanding felt larger than it really was. Then came one of the most surprising differences of all. We disagreed about success. I had always imagined success as reaching specific goals. A stable career. Financial security. A comfortable home. Clear progress. My husband viewed success through a completely different lens. He valued experiences, personal growth, and meaningful relationships more than measurable achievements. One evening, while discussing future plans, we realized how differently we defined a successful life. The conversation was respectful, but it left both of us unsettled. For the first time, I wondered whether our differences might eventually become too large to overcome. That thought frightened me. The strange thing about relationships is that major problems rarely arrive all at once. They arrive quietly. They appear during conversations about holidays, money, schedules, vacations, or future plans. Each disagreement seems manageable on its own. But over time, they begin stacking on top of one another. Like small stones filling a backpack, the weight gradually increases. At the same time, there were still many wonderful moments. We laughed together. We supported each other. We genuinely loved each other. Yet a question kept appearing in the back of my mind. How could two people who cared about each other so deeply see the world so differently? I did not know it then, but this question would shape the next chapter of our story. Because the biggest challenges had not arrived yet. Living separately had allowed us to retreat to our own spaces after disagreements. That safety net was about to disappear. A new phase of life was approaching. We were preparing to share one home, one daily routine, one budget, and one future. If our differences felt noticeable before, they were about to become impossible to ignore. And the moment we started living together, everything changed in ways neither of us saw coming. Moving into one home. Have you ever heard the saying that you do not truly know someone until you live with them? For years, I thought that was just one of those clever phrases people liked to repeat. Then my husband and I moved into our first home together, and suddenly that sentence felt less like a saying and more like a warning label. If dating is like watching a movie trailer, living together is watching the entire film, including all the scenes nobody expected. The day we moved into our new home in the United States felt exciting. We were standing in an empty living room surrounded by boxes, imagining our future. Sunlight came through the windows. Everything felt full of possibility. We talked about family dinners, future holidays, and all the memories we would create. Looking back now, I smile at how optimistic we were. We believed love would naturally solve every challenge. We assumed that because we cared deeply about each other, daily life would somehow organize itself. Reality had other plans. The first surprise arrived almost immediately. Every person develops invisible habits over years of living alone. These habits feel normal because nobody questions them. Then another person enters the picture and suddenly those habits become very visible. I liked putting things back in the same place every time. My husband treated the entire house like a temporary storage area. Keys could appear anywhere. Shoes seemed capable of traveling independently. Coffee mugs occasionally appeared in rooms where nobody remembered leaving them. One morning I spent 20 minutes searching for an important document. When I finally found it, it was sitting on a shelf where I never would have placed it. My husband had moved it while cleaning. He thought he was helping. I thought I was losing my mind. We laughed about it later, but moments like that happened constantly. At first these situations seemed harmless. Then they started accumulating. Researchers sometimes describe a concept called cognitive load. Every small decision, frustration, or adjustment requires mental energy. Individually, these moments seem insignificant. Together, they can become surprisingly exhausting. That was exactly what happened inside our home. Little differences appeared everywhere. I preferred eating dinner at roughly the same time each evening. My husband often lost track of time while working on projects. I liked finishing household chores before relaxing. He preferred relaxing first and dealing with chores later. Neither approach was objectively wrong. Yet each difference created friction. The funny part is that neither of us considered ourselves difficult. In our own minds, we were completely reasonable people. We both believed we were making logical choices. We both believed the other person was overreacting. One evening perfectly captured this dynamic. We were assembling furniture for our living room. The instructions seemed simple. I wanted to follow every step carefully. My husband looked at the instruction booklet for approximately 10 seconds before deciding he could figure it out himself. What followed was a 2-hour adventure involving missing screws, incorrect parts, and a growing level of frustration that would have entertained anyone watching from a safe distance. By the end, we had completed the project, but not before debating which approach was more efficient. Years later, I can barely remember the furniture. I remember the argument. That realization taught me something important. Most couples do not fight about furniture, dishes, schedules, or laundry. They fight about what those things represent. Underneath every disagreement is usually a deeper need. Security, respect, appreciation, freedom, understanding. Living together revealed these hidden needs more clearly than ever before. Another challenge emerged through finances. Sharing a home meant sharing expenses. Rent, utilities, groceries, insurance, maintenance, and countless unexpected costs became part of our everyday reality. Before marriage, financial decisions mainly affected ourselves. Now every decision affected both of us. One month we disagreed about purchasing a new appliance. I viewed it as a necessary investment. My husband thought we could wait. The discussion lasted far longer than either of us expected. Looking back, the appliance itself was not important. What mattered was how each of us approached decision-making. I focused on preventing future problems. He focused on avoiding unnecessary spending. Again, our values were colliding. Financial psychologists often explain that money conversations are rarely about numbers alone. Money represents safety, opportunity, control, independence, and personal history. Two people can look at the same bank account and experience completely different emotions. We were living proof of that idea. Meanwhile, work responsibilities added another layer of complexity. Modern American life moves quickly. Long work hours, commuting, professional expectations, and personal responsibilities can create constant pressure. Some evenings we arrived home exhausted. When people are tired, patience becomes more difficult. Small annoyances suddenly feel larger. Simple conversations become more emotional. Scientific studies have shown that stress affects emotional regulation and decision-making. In other words, a stressful day at work can make a minor household disagreement feel much more serious than it actually is. We experienced this firsthand. There were nights when one careless comment created tension that lasted for hours. Not because the issue was important, but because our emotional batteries were already running low. Yet something interesting was happening beneath all these struggles. Even while we argued, we were learning. We were gathering information about each other. We were discovering how each person reacted under pressure. We were slowly uncovering the fears, hopes, and experiences shaping our behavior. The process was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Imagine two people trying to learn a new language. At first, misunderstandings are unavoidable. Communication feels awkward. Mistakes happen constantly. Progress seems slow. Then gradually patterns emerge. Understanding improves. Conversations become easier. We were not learning Spanish or French. We were learning each other. At the time, however, that progress was difficult to see. All I noticed were the disagreements. One weekend, after a particularly frustrating argument about household responsibilities, I sat alone thinking about our future. A troubling question entered my mind. What if love was not enough? It was a frightening thought because I truly loved my husband. He loved me too. Yet we seemed capable of disagreeing about almost anything. The question stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. What I did not know was that life was preparing an even bigger challenge. Up to this point, most of our conflicts had happened inside the comfort of our home. Soon external pressures would begin testing us as well. Changes in lifestyle, environment, and the realities of American life would push both of us beyond our comfort zones. And when that happened, our differences would become harder to ignore than ever before. The climate and lifestyle shock. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the challenge in your marriage is not only the person sitting across from you at the breakfast table. The challenge is also the weather outside the window, the culture around you, the pace of life in your community, and 100 invisible pressures that quietly shape your mood every day. That was the chapter of our story that neither my husband nor I expected. We thought our biggest obstacle was our different personalities. We were wrong. The environment around us was about to become an unexpected character in our marriage story. And it would test us in ways that no relationship advice book had prepared us for. When people think about life in the United States, they often imagine opportunities, modern cities, beautiful suburbs, and personal freedom. Those things certainly exist. But everyday American life also comes with challenges that can surprise people. Long work hours, rising costs, changing seasons, traffic, social expectations. And the constant pressure to stay productive can affect even the strongest relationships. My husband and I discovered this reality slowly. The first shock came from the climate. I had always imagined weather as a background detail, something that simply existed while life happened around it. Then I experienced how dramatically weather could influence emotions, energy levels, routines, and even marriage. During our first winter together, the cold seemed endless. The days felt shorter. Darkness arrived early in the afternoon. Some mornings the sky looked gray from sunrise to sunset. I preferred staying indoors where it was warm and comfortable. My husband reacted in exactly the opposite way. He wanted fresh air, outdoor activities, and weekend adventures regardless of temperature. Every forecast seemed to create another small disagreement. One Saturday morning, snow covered the neighborhood. I imagined drinking coffee, reading a book, and enjoying a quiet day inside. My husband appeared with the excitement of a child discovering a theme park. "Let's go hiking." I stared at him. "Hiking? In the snow?" The expression on my face probably answered the question before I spoke. To him, the snow looked beautiful. To me, it looked cold. That simple difference became a perfect example of how two people can experience the same situation and create completely different emotional stories about it. Psychologists often explain that our brains constantly interpret reality rather than simply observing it. Events themselves matter, but the meaning we assign to those events matters even more. Snow was not the problem. Our interpretations were. As seasons changed, new challenges appeared. Summer brought its own surprises. Heat waves arrived. Outdoor schedules changed. Utility bills increased. Travel plans required coordination. Every season seemed determined to teach us another lesson about adaptability. Then there was the lifestyle shock. American culture often celebrates independence and personal achievement. People work hard. Schedules fill quickly. Productivity becomes a badge of honor. It is common to hear conversations about goals, projects, deadlines, promotions, and future plans. Without realizing it, both my husband and I began absorbing some of that pressure. We became busier. Then busier still. Our calendars started looking like complicated puzzles. Work meetings. Family responsibilities. Household tasks. Appointments. Community events. Unexpected obligations. At first we handled everything reasonably well. Then the pace accelerated. One evening, I noticed something unsettling. My husband and I were spending more time managing life than actually living it. We discussed schedules more often than dreams. We talked about responsibilities more often than feelings. Some conversations sounded more like business meetings than conversations between two people in love. That realization bothered me. Research from relationship experts has repeatedly shown that emotional connection requires intentional time and attention. Relationships do not usually weaken because of one dramatic event. They often weaken through gradual neglect. Small moments of connection disappear. Conversations become shorter. Curiosity fades. Stress takes over. The process is so slow that many couples barely notice it happening. We certainly did not notice at first. Meanwhile, another interesting challenge emerged from cultural expectations. In many American communities, people are encouraged to express opinions openly and make independent decisions. While this can be a positive thing, it can also create tension inside relationships when two strong personalities share one home. Both my husband and I were confident people. Both of us had opinions. Both of us believed we were being reasonable. You can probably see where this is going. A simple decision about weekend plans could become a 30-minute discussion. A conversation about budgeting could become a debate. A discussion about future goals could feel like a negotiation between two companies preparing a merger. The funny part is that neither of us was trying to dominate the other. We simply cared deeply about our viewpoints. One evening after a particularly exhausting week, we sat quietly in the living room. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. I looked around the room. Nothing was wrong. Our home was safe. We had food. We had jobs. We had each other. Yet the atmosphere felt heavy. That moment reminded me of something researchers have discovered about human happiness. External success and internal satisfaction are not always the same thing. A person can appear successful while feeling disconnected. A family can look stable while struggling with communication. I realized we were not fighting because we disliked each other. We were fighting because stress was magnifying every difference between us. Imagine looking through a magnifying glass. Small details suddenly appear enormous. Stress is the same thing inside relationships. Minor disagreements feel larger. Small frustrations feel more important. Tiny imperfections become impossible to ignore. Once I understood that idea, I started observing our arguments differently. The argument was rarely the real issue. The stress behind the argument was often the real issue. Still, understanding a problem does not automatically solve it. If anything, the awareness made me even more curious. Could two people with different personalities survive modern life together without losing their connection? Could love remain strong while responsibilities continued growing? Could we learn to stop treating each disagreement like a threat? At that stage of our marriage, I honestly did not know. What I did know was that the pressure was building. Our differences had followed us through dating. They had followed us into marriage. They had followed us into our home. Now they were colliding with the realities of climate, lifestyle, work, and daily stress. And the result was becoming impossible to ignore. The next chapter would be even harder. Because soon our disagreements would stop being occasional frustrations and start becoming a pattern. A pattern so predictable that sometimes we could almost guess the argument before it happened. What began as small differences in personality was about to evolve into something much bigger. And for the first time, both my husband and I would wonder whether our marriage could truly survive it. Arguments about everything. Have you ever reached a point where you could predict an argument before it even started? Not because you were psychic, but because the pattern had become so familiar that your brain already knew the script. That was exactly where my husband and I found ourselves. At first, our disagreements seemed random. One week it was about money. Another week it was about schedules. Then it was about vacations, household responsibilities, future plans, or how to spend a Saturday afternoon. Eventually, a strange realization hit me. The topic kept changing, but the feeling stayed the same. It was as if we were watching the same movie over and over again with different costumes and different scenery. The argument always started small. Then it grew. Then both of us felt misunderstood. Then neither of us felt satisfied when it ended. Looking back now, this period became one of the most important chapters of our marriage because it forced me to confront a difficult truth. We were no longer arguing about individual problems. We were arguing about how we argued. One Tuesday evening perfectly captured the situation. We were discussing something incredibly ordinary. Groceries. Not politics. Not life-changing decisions. Groceries. I wanted to shop during a planned weekly trip because it saved time and helped control spending. My husband preferred buying things whenever we needed them. Within minutes, the conversation somehow expanded into budgeting habits, time management, household responsibilities, and personal priorities. By the end, neither of us cared much about groceries anymore. We were defending ourselves. That pattern became surprisingly common. Relationship researchers often describe what is known as escalation. A small disagreement triggers emotional reactions. Those reactions create defensive responses. Defensive responses create stronger reactions. Before long, the original issue becomes almost irrelevant. The conversation transforms into a competition rather than a collaboration. Without realizing it, we had entered that cycle. The frustrating part was that both of us genuinely wanted a happy marriage. Neither of us woke up each morning planning to create conflict. Neither of us wanted to hurt the other person. Yet conflict kept appearing. One reason was our different problem-solving styles. When I saw a problem, I wanted to address it immediately. I believed discussing issues quickly would prevent them from growing larger. My husband preferred giving situations time. He often wanted space to think before talking. Imagine two firefighters responding to the same fire. One grabs water immediately. The other studies the situation before acting. Both want to solve the problem. Both believe their approach is correct. Now imagine they are trying to work together while disagreeing about the strategy. That was us. The more pressure we felt, the more obvious our differences became. Then another challenge arrived. Future planning. Few topics reveal personal values more quickly than conversations about the future. We started discussing long-term goals more seriously. Where should we live? How much should we save? What kind of lifestyle did we want? How would we raise future children? What risks were acceptable? What risks should be avoided? These conversations often began calmly. Then something interesting happened. We were not actually debating facts. We were debating fears. I feared instability. My husband feared limitation. I worried about unexpected problems. He worried about missing opportunities. Scientists who study decision-making have found that human beings are heavily influenced by loss aversion. In simple terms, people often work harder to avoid losses than to gain benefits. The fascinating part is that different people define loss differently. For me, financial uncertainty felt like a loss. For my husband, excessive caution felt like a loss. As a result, we often reacted to the same situation in completely opposite ways. One evening, we discussed a possible career opportunity that involved uncertainty. I immediately started identifying potential risks. My husband focused on potential rewards. Neither perspective was completely wrong. Yet we spent nearly an hour defending our viewpoints. Afterward, I sat quietly wondering why simple conversations seemed so difficult. The answer arrived unexpectedly a few days later. I was listening to a podcast about relationships during a drive home from work. One expert explained that many couples make a critical mistake. They assume disagreement means incompatibility. That sentence stayed with me. Because deep down, I had started believing exactly that. Every argument felt like evidence. Evidence that we were too different. Evidence that something was wrong. Evidence that our marriage might be weaker than other marriages. But what if those assumptions were inaccurate? The question intrigued me. Later that week, I started paying closer attention to couples around us. Friends, neighbors, coworkers, Family members. Something surprising emerged. Happy couples disagreed too. A lot. The difference was not the absence of disagreement. The difference was how they interpreted disagreement. Some couples treated disagreements as problems to solve together. We often treated disagreements as battles to win. That realization was uncomfortable. Nobody enjoys discovering they may be contributing to their own frustration. Yet growth often begins with uncomfortable observations. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. Work responsibilities increased. Expenses continued arriving. Unexpected challenges appeared. The pressure of everyday American life did not pause so we could improve our communication skills. In fact, stress sometimes made everything worse. Studies have shown that chronic stress affects emotional regulation, memory, and patience. When people feel overwhelmed, the brain becomes more reactive. Small irritations feel larger. Neutral comments can sound critical. Simple misunderstandings become emotionally charged. I could see those patterns inside our own home. A stressful day often produced shorter tempers. A long week often created more conflict. Fatigue became an invisible third participant in many of our conversations. One night, after another disagreement, I walked outside and sat alone for a while. The neighborhood was quiet. The air felt cool. For the first time, I asked myself a question that genuinely scared me. What if love alone is not enough? It felt almost disloyal to think it. I loved my husband. He loved me. Yet we seemed trapped inside the same cycle. Disagreement. Frustration. Temporary resolution. Repeat. The cycle felt endless. What I did not know at that moment was that we were approaching a turning point. Not a magical turning point. Not the kind you see in movies where one conversation suddenly fixes everything. Something much more realistic. Much more painful. And ultimately much more important. Because soon an event would occur that forced both of us to confront a possibility we had been avoiding. For the first time, we would seriously question whether our marriage could survive. For the first time, walking away would seem easier than staying. And strangely enough, that dark moment would become the beginning of everything that changed afterward. The day we nearly gave up. There is a moment in some relationships that feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. Nothing dramatic may be happening on the outside. No movie soundtrack plays in the background. No thunder crashes across the sky. Yet inside, something feels different. You suddenly realize that the future you always assumed would happen is no longer guaranteed. That moment arrived for my husband and me on a rainy evening that seemed completely ordinary at first. Looking back, I can still remember the sound of water hitting the windows, the dim light in our living room, and the heavy silence that filled the space between us. Ironically, the day had not started with a major problem. It began with several small frustrations, the kind that many couples experience every day. Work stress. Unexpected expenses. Scheduling conflicts. Fatigue. Nothing extraordinary. Yet sometimes a relationship is like a bridge carrying weight. One extra pound does not cause damage. Another pound does not matter either. But eventually, if enough pressure accumulates without relief, even a strong bridge begins to strain. That evening, we were discussing finances. At least that is how the conversation started. An unexpected expense had appeared, and we disagreed about how to handle it. Within minutes, the discussion expanded beyond the actual issue. Old frustrations resurfaced. Previous disagreements returned. Words that had remained unspoken for months suddenly entered the room. You may have experienced something similar. A conversation that begins in one place somehow travels through 6 months of unresolved emotions before it ends. That was exactly what happened. The strange thing about emotional arguments is that people often stop listening to understand. Instead, they start listening to respond. I was preparing my next point while my husband was still speaking. He was doing the same thing. Neither of us realized it. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as reactive communication. When emotions become intense, the brain shifts into a defensive mode. The goal changes from understanding the other person to protecting yourself. Logical thinking becomes less effective. Empathy becomes harder. Misunderstandings multiply. We were trapped inside that process. Every sentence seemed to create another disagreement. Every explanation sounded like criticism. Every attempt to defend ourselves created more distance. At one point, my husband stopped talking completely. That silence scared me more than the argument itself. Normally, even when we disagreed, the conversation continued. This time felt different. The room became quiet. Painfully quiet. I remember looking at him and realizing that neither of us looked angry anymore. We looked tired. Completely exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Months of repeated conflict had drained us. For the first time, I saw something in his expression that I had not noticed before. Discouragement. The kind that develops slowly. The kind that appears after many unsuccessful attempts to solve the same problem. Then he asked a question I will never forget. What if we're just too different? The words landed heavily. Not because they were cruel. Because they were honest. And honesty can sometimes feel heavier than anger. I did not answer immediately. Part of me wanted to reject the idea instantly. Another part of me feared he might be right. That was the moment when the possibility of failure stopped feeling theoretical. For months, we had been telling ourselves that things would improve eventually. That difficult seasons happen. That all couples struggle sometimes. Those statements were true. But sitting there that evening, they suddenly felt less comforting. I found myself wondering whether love could survive constant misunderstanding. Researchers who study long-term relationships have identified an interesting pattern. The happiest couples are not necessarily the couples with the fewest problems. Instead, they often possess a strong belief that challenges can be worked through together. Relationship experts sometimes call this a growth mindset within marriage. The opposite belief is far more dangerous. The belief that problems are permanent. The belief that differences are proof of incompatibility. The belief that improvement is impossible. Without realizing it, my husband and I had slowly drifted toward that second mindset. Every disagreement became evidence. Evidence that we were incompatible. Evidence that we were failing. Evidence that something was fundamentally wrong. That perspective made every conflict feel larger. And that night, it felt enormous. After our conversation ended, I went for a walk despite the rain. I needed space to think. The streets were nearly empty. Water reflected the lights from nearby houses. Everything felt unusually still. As I walked, I replayed years of memories. Our first conversations. Our first dates. The excitement we felt when imagining our future. The laughter. The dreams. The plans. None of those memories matched the discouragement I was feeling now. That contradiction confused me. How could two people who genuinely loved each other end up here? The answer began appearing slowly. Not all at once. Just small realizations. One after another. The first realization was surprisingly simple. We had become experts at identifying each other's weaknesses. Years of conflict had trained us well. I could predict what would frustrate him. He could predict what would frustrate me. Unfortunately, we had become much less skilled at noticing strengths. The second realization felt even more uncomfortable. Many of our arguments were no longer about solving problems. They were about proving points. And proving points rarely improves relationships. Winning an argument can feel satisfying for 5 minutes. Feeling understood can improve a relationship for years. Yet we had spent far more energy chasing victory than understanding. The third realization was the most important. Neither of us was the enemy. The problem was the enemy. Stress was the enemy. Miscommunication was the enemy. Assumptions were the enemy. But somewhere along the way, we had started treating each other like opponents instead of teammates. That thought stayed with me during the entire walk home. When I finally returned, my husband was still awake. The tension had not disappeared. The problems had not magically solved themselves. Yet something had shifted. Not in our circumstances. In my perspective. For the first time in months, I stopped asking whether my husband was the problem. I started asking a different question. What if we have been fighting the wrong battle? I did not know it then, but that question would become the beginning of our recovery. Not because it solved everything. Far from it. Many disagreements still waited ahead. Many difficult conversations remained. But the question opened a door. A door neither of us had noticed before. Because after nearly giving up, we would finally begin learning a skill that should have existed from the very beginning. Not arguing better. Not winning more often. Not becoming identical people. Something far more powerful. We would learn how to truly listen. And that simple skill would change the direction of our marriage more than any argument ever could. Learning to really listen. Imagine spending years believing that communication means talking. Only to discover that the skill that saves your marriage has almost nothing to do with speaking. That realization arrived in one of the most unexpected ways possible. After the difficult period when my husband and I nearly gave up, I assumed we needed better solutions, better strategies, or better compromises. What I did not realize was that our biggest problem was much simpler. We were hearing each other's words, but we were not truly listening. The difference sounds small. In reality, it changed everything. If you have ever felt misunderstood by someone you love, or if you are learning English through stories like this and trying to understand people more deeply, this chapter may be one of the most important parts of the entire journey. A few days after that rainy evening, something unusual happened. We were sitting at the kitchen table. No argument. No major crisis. No dramatic conversation. Just two tired people trying to figure out what to do next. Normally, one of us would start explaining our perspective immediately. We would defend our position. We would present evidence. We would explain why we were right. This time, however, neither of us seemed interested in another debate. Perhaps we were too exhausted. Perhaps we had finally reached the point where being right felt less important than finding peace. Whatever the reason, the conversation unfolded differently. My husband started talking. At first, I prepared my usual response. Then I stopped myself. Instead of planning what I wanted to say next, I decided to focus entirely on understanding what he was saying. That sounds obvious. It sounds easy. It was neither. In fact, it felt surprisingly difficult. Researchers studying human communication have found that people often listen with the intention of replying rather than understanding. While another person is speaking, the brain quietly prepares arguments, opinions, corrections, or advice. I suddenly realized how often I had been doing exactly that. For years, I believed I was a good listener. Now I was not so sure. As my husband continued speaking, I noticed something important. Many of the things he said were not new. I had heard similar words before. The difference was that this time I was actually paying attention to the emotions underneath them. Instead of hearing complaints, I heard concerns. Instead of hearing criticism, I heard fears. Instead of hearing disagreement, I heard vulnerability. It was like watching a movie with the sound turned on after years of reading subtitles. Details I had missed suddenly became obvious. He explained that some of my constant planning made him feel as though there was no room for spontaneity. Years earlier, I would have immediately defended myself. This time I simply listened. Then something remarkable happened. For the first time in a long while, he kept talking. Not because he was winning. Not because I agreed with everything. Because he felt heard. Psychologists often discuss a concept called emotional validation. Validation does not mean agreeing with someone. It means acknowledging that their feelings make sense from their perspective. That distinction changed my understanding of communication. For years, I assumed that if I validated his feelings, I was admitting he was right and I was wrong. In reality, validation was simply recognizing his experience. Nothing more. Nothing less. Later, when it was my turn to speak, I noticed another difference. My husband listened. Actually listened. He was not interrupting. He was not preparing a defense. He was not searching for weaknesses in my argument. He was trying to understand. The experience felt surprisingly emotional. Why? Because understanding is one of the most powerful human needs. People want advice. People want solutions. People want support. But before all those things, most people simply want to feel understood. Scientific studies have repeatedly shown that feeling emotionally understood reduces stress and increases relationship satisfaction. The brain literally responds differently when a person feels heard. That knowledge fascinated me. For years, we had searched for complicated solutions to our marriage problems. Meanwhile, one of the most effective tools had been available the entire time. Listening. Real listening. Not waiting. Not correcting. Not preparing a response. Listening. Of course, learning this skill was not a magical transformation. We did not suddenly become perfect communicators. Far from it. Old habits do not disappear overnight. Sometimes we still interrupted each other. Sometimes we still became defensive. Sometimes we still misunderstood each other. But something fundamental had changed. The goal of our conversations was no longer victory. The goal became understanding. That shift created a powerful chain reaction. Arguments became shorter. Frustration decreased. Small disagreements stayed small. Even when we disagreed, the emotional intensity often remained lower. One evening provided a perfect example. We were discussing a future financial decision, a topic that would normally lead to a lengthy debate. I expressed my concerns. My husband listened. Then he explained his perspective. I listened. Neither of us completely changed our opinion. Yet somehow the conversation felt productive. By the end, we understood each other better. The problem remained. The conflict did not. That distinction was incredibly important. Many couples believe successful communication means eliminating differences. That is not always realistic. Sometimes successful communication simply means managing differences without damaging the relationship. Around that time, I encountered an interesting study from relationship researchers. The study suggested that long-term relationship success is influenced less by compatibility than by responsiveness. In simple terms, successful couples respond to each other with curiosity, empathy, and respect. That idea challenged many assumptions I had carried for years. Maybe the secret was not finding someone exactly like yourself. Maybe the secret was learning how to navigate differences together. That perspective changed how I viewed our entire marriage. Suddenly, our differences no longer looked like evidence of failure. They looked like opportunities to practice understanding. Not easy opportunities, but valuable ones. As weeks passed, another surprising benefit appeared. The atmosphere inside our home felt lighter. Conversations became more relaxed. Laughter returned more often. Small moments of connection appeared naturally. The house itself had not changed. Our jobs had not changed. Our responsibilities had not disappeared. Yet life felt different. Because the emotional environment had changed. Looking back, I often compare relationships to learning a language. At first everything feels confusing. Mistakes happen constantly. Misunderstandings are inevitable. Progress feels slow. Then one day you realize you understand things that once seemed impossible. Not because the language became easier. Because you became better at listening. That lesson would become one of the most valuable discoveries of our marriage. Yet it was only the beginning. Listening helped us understand each other. The next challenge was learning how to transform that understanding into daily action. Because awareness alone does not change a relationship. Habits do. And soon, a series of surprisingly small habits would begin creating changes neither of us expected. Tiny adjustments. Simple routines. Almost invisible choices. The kind of changes that seem insignificant at first. Yet those small habits would slowly rebuild the foundation of our marriage and prepare us for a stronger future than either of us thought possible. Small habits changed. Most people expect life-changing transformations to arrive with dramatic speeches, breakthrough moments, or huge decisions. Movies have trained us to believe that one powerful conversation can solve years of problems. Real life is usually much less dramatic and far more interesting. The biggest improvements in my marriage did not begin with a grand promise. They began with habits so small that they almost seemed unimportant. In fact, if someone had told me that a few simple daily actions would help transform a relationship that once felt stuck, I probably would have laughed. Yet that is exactly what happened. After my husband and I learned how to listen more carefully, we faced a new challenge. Understanding each other was valuable, but understanding alone was not enough. We needed new behaviors. We needed practical ways to turn good intentions into daily reality. What happened next surprised both of us. One morning, I noticed something unusual. My husband thanked me for something extremely ordinary. It was not a major accomplishment. I had simply completed a household task. Normally, neither of us would have mentioned it. That day, however, he looked at me and said, "Thank you. I appreciate that." The sentence lasted only a few seconds. Yet it changed my mood for hours. Why? Because appreciation is powerful. Researchers studying relationships have repeatedly found that positive interactions play a major role in long-term satisfaction. People often assume strong relationships depend primarily on solving problems. While problem-solving matters, healthy relationships also require positive emotional experiences. In simple terms, relationships need deposits as well as withdrawals. That tiny moment inspired an experiment. I started expressing appreciation more often. Not in a forced way. Not because a relationship expert told me to do it. Because I realized how meaningful it felt. Soon our home began changing in subtle ways. Thank you became more common. Small acts of kindness became more visible. Effort became easier to notice. The fascinating part was that none of these actions required significant time or money. They required attention. And attention is one of the most valuable gifts people can offer each other. Another small habit emerged almost by accident. We started checking in with each other at the end of the day. Not long conversations. Sometimes just 10 minutes. No phones. No television. No distractions. Just two people talking. At first, the discussions focused on daily events. Work updates. Funny stories. Minor frustrations. Simple observations. Over time, however, those conversations became something much more important. They created connection. Modern life in the United States can move incredibly fast. Between work responsibilities, family obligations, household tasks, and digital distractions, entire weeks can disappear before people realize how little meaningful conversation has occurred. Our nightly check-ins acted like a reset button. They helped prevent emotional distance from quietly growing. Psychologists often describe relationships as dynamic systems. In other words, relationships are constantly changing. They are either becoming stronger or weaker through daily interactions. They rarely remain completely still. That idea fascinated me. Because it meant that tiny actions performed consistently could create enormous results over time. The same principle appears in many areas of life. Exercise. Learning. Finances. Health. Relationships. Small improvements repeated regularly often outperform large efforts performed occasionally. Once I understood that concept, I started noticing opportunities everywhere. Another habit involved assumptions. For years, my husband and I had developed a tendency to assume negative intentions during disagreements. If he forgot something, I assumed he did not care. If I became frustrated, he sometimes assumed I was criticizing him. Those assumptions created unnecessary tension. Then we adopted a simple rule. Ask before assuming. The rule sounds almost childish. Yet it dramatically reduced misunderstandings. Instead of assuming, we asked questions. What did you mean by that? Can you explain what happened? What were you thinking at that moment? Curiosity replaced many of our assumptions. And curiosity is far more productive than mind reading. Scientists who study cognitive biases explain that humans naturally fill information gaps with personal interpretations. Unfortunately, those interpretations are often inaccurate. By asking questions, we gave ourselves access to actual information rather than imagined stories. That single habit prevented countless unnecessary conflicts. Then came one of the most surprising changes of all. We started laughing more. That might sound insignificant. It was not. For a long time, our relationship had become overly serious. Every disagreement felt important. Every decision felt consequential. Every conversation seemed connected to a larger issue. Somewhere along the way, we had forgotten how valuable humor could be. Research suggests that shared laughter strengthens social bonds, reduces stress, and improves emotional resilience. People often underestimate its impact because it feels simple. Yet simple does not mean weak. One evening we found ourselves arguing about directions while driving. A situation that had occurred many times before. Normally the discussion would have escalated. Instead, something ridiculous happened. We both realized neither of us actually knew where we were going. The situation became so absurd that we started laughing. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. The kind that makes it difficult to continue being annoyed. That moment reminded us that not every mistake required a conflict. Sometimes mistakes were simply funny. As months passed, another pattern emerged. The small habits were beginning to influence larger situations. Financial discussions became calmer. Scheduling decisions became easier. Future planning became more collaborative. The changes were gradual. Almost invisible day to day. Yet undeniable over time. One reason these habits worked is supported by behavioral science. Researchers often emphasize the power of consistency. Human brains respond strongly to repeated experiences. Consistent positive interactions gradually shape expectations, trust, and emotional security. In other words, relationships are influenced less by occasional grand gestures than by repeated daily experiences. That realization changed how I viewed marriage. I stopped searching for perfect solutions. I started focusing on daily choices. A kind word. A question. A moment of patience. A small act of appreciation. A shared laugh. Individually, these actions seemed tiny. Collectively, they transformed the atmosphere inside our home. Still, life was preparing us for another major test. Because improving communication and building healthy habits is one thing. Raising children together is something entirely different. Soon, my husband and I would enter a new chapter filled with sleepless nights, unexpected responsibilities, emotional challenges, and life-changing joy. The arrival of children would force us to apply every lesson we had learned. And it would reveal whether our marriage had truly become stronger or whether we had simply become more comfortable. What happened next would teach us the difference between being partners in theory and becoming a real team in practice. Building a strong family. If you think marriage reveals your strengths and weaknesses, wait until children enter the picture. Nothing exposes habits, assumptions, fears, hopes, and communication patterns faster than becoming parents. Before our children arrived, my husband and I believed we had made significant progress. We listened better. We argued less. We understood each other more clearly. Then parenthood arrived like a surprise final exam covering every lesson we thought we had already learned. Suddenly, the skills that seemed optional became essential. The habits that felt helpful became necessary. And the differences that once caused frustration returned in entirely new forms. Yet strangely enough, this chapter became one of the most rewarding parts of our journey. It was also the chapter that finally taught us how to become a team. I still remember the day we brought our first child home. The house looked exactly the same. Yet everything felt different. The rooms seemed quieter. The responsibilities seemed larger. Even time itself appeared to move differently. Before children, many decisions affected only my husband and me. Now another human being depended on us completely. That realization was both beautiful and terrifying. Almost immediately, our differences resurfaced. Not because we were doing anything wrong. Because parenting naturally raises important questions. How should we create routines? How strict should rules be? How much freedom should children have? How should discipline work? What values matter most? What traditions should we keep? What risks are acceptable? What risks should be avoided? The questions seemed endless. And unsurprisingly, we did not always agree. One evening, our child refused to go to bed on time. A simple parenting challenge. Yet within minutes, my husband and I found ourselves discussing completely different solutions. I preferred structure and consistency. My husband preferred flexibility and adaptation. Sound familiar? It should. The same differences that shaped our marriage now influenced our parenting. For a brief moment, I worried that we were returning to old patterns. But something interesting happened. Instead of arguing about who was right, we started asking a different question. What approach would help our child most? That small shift changed everything. The focus moved away from our egos and toward a shared goal. Psychologists often explain that successful teams perform better when members focus on collective outcomes rather than individual victories. Families work much the same way. The moment we stopped trying to win discussions and started trying to solve problems together, parenting became easier. Not easy. Just easier. Of course, children introduce challenges that no book fully prepares you for. Sleep deprivation became a regular visitor. And sleep deprivation is a fascinating thing. Researchers have shown that insufficient sleep affects emotional regulation, patience, memory, and decision-making. In simple terms, tired people become less patient and more reactive. Parents everywhere already know this without reading research. A person who has slept 3 hours does not always display their best communication skills. My husband and I certainly experienced this reality. There were nights when both of us felt exhausted. Minor frustrations seemed larger. Simple tasks felt more difficult. Yet something important had changed compared to earlier years. We no longer viewed each other as opponents. When one of us struggled, the other tried to help. Not perfectly. Not every time. But more consistently. That distinction mattered. Another surprising lesson emerged through observing our children. Children are remarkable mirrors. They watch everything. Not just what parents say. What parents do. The way parents solve problems. The way parents handle stress. The way parents communicate. One afternoon, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Our child was trying to resolve a disagreement with a friend. The language sounded familiar. Very familiar. In fact, it sounded like one of the conversations my husband and I had practiced at home. Listening. Explaining feelings. Asking questions. Seeking understanding. Watching that moment felt incredibly rewarding. Because it reminded me that family culture develops through daily examples. Children learn relationship skills partly by observing relationships. That realization motivated us even more. Not because we wanted to appear perfect. Because we wanted to model growth. The truth is that no family functions perfectly. Every household experiences conflict. Every parent makes mistakes. Every marriage encounters challenges. The goal is not perfection. The goal is learning. As years passed, family life became both busier and richer. School activities appeared. Sports schedules arrived. Weekend commitments multiplied. Our calendars once again became complicated. Yet the atmosphere felt different from earlier chapters of our marriage. Previously, busyness often created distance. Now we intentionally protected connection. Family dinners became important. Shared traditions mattered. Small conversations received attention. Research consistently suggests that strong family relationships are built through regular interactions rather than rare extraordinary experiences. That idea matched our experience perfectly. Some of our happiest memories were surprisingly ordinary. Cooking together. Walking through a neighborhood park. Watching a movie on a rainy evening. Talking around the dinner table. The moments were simple. The impact was not. Another lesson arrived through mistakes. Because despite our progress, mistakes still happened. Plans failed. Misunderstandings occurred. Occasional arguments returned. The difference was our response. Earlier in our marriage, mistakes often triggered blame. Now they triggered discussion. That shift created resilience. Researchers who study family systems often emphasize adaptability. Healthy families are not those that avoid problems. Healthy families are those that recover from problems effectively. That concept became one of our guiding principles. Problems were inevitable. Recovery was a choice. Looking back, I sometimes laugh at the younger version of myself. The woman who believed compatibility meant agreement. The woman who thought strong marriages experienced very little conflict. The woman who worried that differences automatically threatened relationships. Parenthood challenged those assumptions completely. Because raising children together revealed something important. A strong family does not require identical people. A strong family requires committed people. People willing to learn. People willing to adapt. People willing to support each other even when they disagree. Yet another fascinating chapter still awaited us. As our family continued growing and changing, I became increasingly curious about something larger. Why had our marriage improved so dramatically? Why do some couples grow stronger through challenges while others grow apart? Was it luck? Personality? Timing? Or was there a deeper explanation supported by science? The search for that answer would lead me toward some fascinating discoveries about love, relationships, human behavior, and the surprising psychology behind long-term happiness. And those discoveries would help me understand our journey in a completely new way. American family life today. What does a happy family actually look like in real life? Not in advertisements. Not in movies. Not in perfectly edited social media posts. Real life. That question fascinated me for years because the answer turned out to be very different from what I expected when I was younger. At one time, I believed a happy family meant a family with very few disagreements. Then I believed it meant financial stability. Later, I thought it meant achieving certain goals. Today, after everything my husband and I experienced together, I see family life through a completely different lens. The most surprising part is that our life now would probably look ordinary to many people. Yet hidden inside that ordinary life are lessons that transformed our marriage, our parenting, and our understanding of happiness. If you are learning English through stories, this chapter may also help you understand modern family culture in the United States and why many people are searching for something deeper than success alone. These days, our mornings begin much earlier than I once imagined. Children have a remarkable ability to ignore adult preferences regarding sleep schedules. Some mornings start with laughter. Some start with chaos. Most start with both. Breakfast conversations move quickly. Someone cannot find a backpack. Someone forgot an assignment. Someone needs help with a project. Meanwhile, my husband and I coordinate schedules, responsibilities, and daily plans. Years ago, situations like this might have triggered frustration. Today, they often trigger teamwork. Not because we became perfect. Because we learned that cooperation requires less energy than conflict. That lesson sounds simple. It took us years to learn. One thing I appreciate about American family culture is the emphasis many families place on individual interests and personal growth. Children are often encouraged to explore activities, develop skills, and express opinions. Of course, every family is different, but many communities support sports, arts, volunteering, education, and personal development. Watching our children grow within that environment has been fascinating. Every child develops a unique personality. Every child sees the world differently. And surprisingly, parenting has helped me understand my husband better. Why? Because some of our children inherited certain traits from him. Others inherited traits from me. Sometimes I watch one of our children approach a challenge exactly as my husband would. Other times, I see reflections of myself. Those moments remind me how different perspectives can exist within the same family and still contribute something valuable. Another aspect of American family life that surprised me is the constant balancing act. Work, family, health, education, friendships, community involvement, personal goals. Modern life asks people to juggle many responsibilities simultaneously. Researchers often discuss something called role strain, which occurs when individuals manage multiple important responsibilities at the same time. The more roles people occupy, the more pressure they may experience. Parents understand this concept very well. Some days feel smooth. Other days feel like solving a complicated puzzle while riding a bicycle through a thunderstorm. Yet even during busy periods, our family has developed traditions that help us stay connected. For example, we protect certain routines. Family dinners whenever possible. Weekend activities together. Conversations without screens. Simple traditions may not appear impressive from the outside, but research consistently suggests that shared routines strengthen family relationships. Why? Because routines create predictability. Predictability creates emotional security. And emotional security creates stronger connections. One evening illustrates this perfectly. It was an ordinary weekday. Nothing special had happened. No birthdays. No holidays. No celebrations. We were simply eating dinner together. The conversation moved from school stories to funny memories to future dreams. At one point, everyone was laughing. I remember looking around the table and realizing something important. Years earlier, I had imagined happiness as a destination. A place we would eventually reach. Instead, happiness often appeared in small moments like this. Unexpected. Ordinary. Easy to overlook. That realization changed the way I evaluate success. Many people living in the United States face pressure to achieve more, earn more, and accomplish more. Ambition can be valuable. Hard work matters. Goals matter. But there is an interesting psychological phenomenon called the hedonic treadmill. Researchers use this term to describe how people often adapt quickly to positive changes. Achievements create happiness, but the feeling may fade as new expectations emerge. A promotion becomes normal. A larger home becomes normal. A new achievement becomes normal. Then people start chasing the next goal. Understanding this concept helped me appreciate everyday experiences more deeply. Because some of life's greatest rewards cannot be measured through achievements. Trust. Connection. Belonging. Love. These experiences often grow quietly over time. Family life has taught me that lesson repeatedly. Of course, challenges still exist. Arguments still happen occasionally. Schedules still become overwhelming. Unexpected problems still appear. No family escapes those realities. The difference lies in how we respond. Earlier in our marriage, challenges often felt like threats. Now they feel more like puzzles. Sometimes frustrating puzzles. But puzzles nonetheless. That mindset shift has been incredibly valuable. Another thing I have noticed is that our children pay close attention to how we handle difficulties. Not just major crises. Everyday setbacks. Traffic delays. Scheduling problems. Mistakes. Disappointments. Life provides endless opportunities to model resilience. Psychologists frequently emphasize that resilience develops through experience rather than theory. People become resilient by facing challenges, adapting, learning, and continuing forward. Families can support that process. In many ways, our home has become a place where learning happens continuously. Not just academic learning. Life learning. Relationship learning. Communication learning. Growth learning. Sometimes the lessons arrive through success. Sometimes they arrive through mistakes. Both forms of learning matter. Looking around our home today, I sometimes remember the younger version of myself who worried that our differences would destroy our marriage. If she could see us now, she would probably be surprised. Not because our differences disappeared. They did not. Many still exist. I still enjoy planning. My husband still enjoys spontaneity. I still prefer structure. He still values flexibility. The differences remain. What changed was our ability to work with them. That realization led me toward a fascinating question. If our differences were not the real problem, then what actually determines whether relationships succeed? Why do some couples grow stronger through challenges while others grow apart? What does science reveal about love, communication, trust, and long-term happiness? The answers turned out to be far more encouraging than I expected. And discovering them helped me understand why our marriage survived when, at one point, it seemed so close to falling apart. What science says about love. What if I told you that one of the biggest myths about relationships is also one of the most popular? For years, I believed that successful couples were simply lucky enough to find the right person. Somewhere out there, I imagined, existed perfectly compatible partners who naturally agreed on most things and rarely struggled with communication. It sounds romantic. It also happens to be deeply misleading. The more I learned about relationship science, psychology, and human behavior, the more I realized that my husband and I were not unusual because we disagreed. We were normal. In fact, many of the discoveries that saved our marriage came from understanding something surprisingly encouraging. Healthy relationships are not built by eliminating differences. They are built by learning how to navigate them. That realization changed the way I viewed love, marriage, family, and even myself. One of the first scientific findings that caught my attention came from decades of relationship research. Experts studying long-term couples discovered something fascinating. Many recurring disagreements never completely disappear. Think about that for a moment. Many couples spend years trying to solve certain conflicts permanently. Yet research suggests that some differences remain throughout the relationship. At first, that information sounded discouraging. Then it became liberating. Why? Because it removed an unrealistic expectation. My husband and I had spent years believing that successful marriage required complete resolution of every disagreement. Science suggested something different. Success often depends less on eliminating differences and more on managing them constructively. Suddenly, our story made much more sense. We were not failing because we disagreed. We struggled because we interpreted disagreement incorrectly. Another fascinating discovery involved something called emotional responsiveness. Researchers consistently found that strong relationships are characterized by partners responding to each other's emotional needs with attention, empathy, and care. Notice something important. The focus is not perfection. The focus is responsiveness. That distinction matters. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, someone shares a concern and receives criticism. In the second, someone shares a concern and receives curiosity. The problem may remain identical. The emotional experience becomes completely different. Looking back at our marriage, I realized that many improvements began when my husband and I became more responsive to each other. Not because we suddenly agreed on everything. Because we became more willing to understand each other. Then I discovered research about something called the negativity bias. Human brains are naturally designed to pay more attention to problems than positive experiences. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Our ancestors survived by noticing threats. The downside is that modern humans often focus excessively on what is wrong while overlooking what is working. This concept explained so much about our difficult years. Whenever my husband and I argued, our attention immediately moved toward the conflict. Meanwhile, positive interactions faded into the background. 100 good moments could occur. One disagreement would dominate our attention. Scientists have repeatedly shown that negative experiences often carry greater psychological weight than positive ones. Understanding this bias helped us become more intentional. We started noticing what was working. We started appreciating progress. We started acknowledging effort. Not because life became perfect. Because our brains needed reminders. Another concept that fascinated me was attachment theory. Psychologists use attachment theory to explain how early experiences can influence adult relationships. Different people often develop different approaches to emotional connection, trust, and conflict. Some people seek closeness quickly. Others value independence more strongly. Neither tendency automatically creates problems. The challenge appears when people misunderstand each other's needs. Learning about attachment helped me see our disagreements differently. Sometimes my desire for planning was connected to security. Sometimes my husband's desire for flexibility was connected to autonomy. The issue was rarely the surface-level topic. The issue was often the emotional need beneath it. That realization transformed many conversations. Instead of arguing about specific decisions, we started exploring underlying concerns. The results were remarkable. Researchers have also studied gratitude extensively. The findings are surprisingly powerful. People who regularly express appreciation often experience stronger relationships, greater life satisfaction, and improved emotional well-being. When I first encountered these studies, I thought the idea sounded too simple. Then I remembered the small habits that changed our marriage. Thanking each other. Acknowledging effort. Recognizing kindness. The science matched our experience perfectly. Small expressions of appreciation created large emotional effects. Another discovery involved conflict itself. Many people assume that conflict is evidence of relationship weakness. Research paints a more nuanced picture. The absence of conflict does not necessarily indicate a healthy relationship. Sometimes it indicates avoidance. Healthy relationships often include disagreement. The critical factor is how conflict is handled. Do people attack each other? Do they become defensive? Do they stop communicating? Or do they remain respectful while working through differences? That distinction may determine far more than the conflict itself. When I learned this, I felt relieved. Our goal did not need to be eliminating all disagreements. Our goal could be improving how we handled them. That felt achievable. Then came one of my favorite discoveries. Researchers studying long-term happiness frequently emphasize the importance of relationships. Across numerous studies, strong social connections consistently predict greater well-being. Not perfect careers. Not perfect houses. Not perfect circumstances. Relationships. Again and again, human connection appears near the center of a meaningful life. That finding resonated deeply with me. Because when I looked back at the most meaningful moments in my own life, very few involved achievements. Most involved people. Conversations. Shared experiences. Family memories. Acts of kindness. Moments of connection. Science seemed to confirm what many people intuitively feel. Humans are wired for relationships. Of course, understanding research did not magically solve every challenge. Knowledge helps. Practice matters more. A person can read 100 books about communication and still struggle to listen. A person can understand relationship science and still become impatient after a stressful day. Information alone changes very little. Applied information changes everything. That is why the lessons my husband and I learned became so valuable. We were not simply collecting ideas. We were practicing them. Sometimes successfully. Sometimes imperfectly. But consistently. And consistency creates transformation. The more I studied these concepts, the clearer our journey became. We survived not because we became identical people. We survived because we learned skills. Listening. Empathy. Patience. Curiosity. Gratitude. Adaptability. Those skills strengthened our relationship far more than compatibility ever could. Yet one final chapter remained. A chapter that would bring everything together. Because after years of disagreements, misunderstandings, growth, parenting, and learning, I found myself reflecting on a question that once seemed impossible to answer. How did two people who disagreed about almost everything manage to build a happy life together? The answer was waiting at the end of the journey. And it was much simpler than I ever expected. The happy ending we created. What if the secret to a lasting marriage is not finding someone who agrees with you, but learning how to love someone who does not? If you had asked me that question years ago, I probably would have given a very different answer. Back then, I believed compatibility meant similarity. I believed successful couples naturally understood each other. I believed happy marriages experienced fewer disagreements than struggling ones. Then life happened. Marriage happened. Parenthood happened. Real life replaced assumptions. And now, after everything my husband and I have experienced together, I can finally answer the question that started this entire story. How did two people who disagreed about almost everything survive? The answer is surprisingly simple. We stopped trying to become the same people and started learning how to become a stronger team. When I think back to those early years, I almost feel like I am remembering two different stories. One story is about conflict. Arguments about money. Arguments about schedules. Arguments about responsibilities. Arguments about future plans. Arguments about parenting. Arguments about things so small that I can barely remember them today. The other story is about growth. Learning to listen. Learning to understand. Learning to adapt. Learning to appreciate. Learning to forgive. Learning to work together. The fascinating thing is that both stories happened at the same time. The challenges were real. The growth was real too. For a long time, I thought our differences were obstacles standing in the way of happiness. Now I see them differently. Many of those differences became teachers. My husband taught me flexibility. He taught me that not every situation requires a detailed plan. He taught me that some opportunities appear unexpectedly and should be embraced. He taught me that life is often richer when there is room for spontaneity. At the same time, I influenced him as well. I helped him appreciate preparation. I helped him think about long-term goals. I helped create stability during uncertain moments. Neither of us abandoned our personalities. Neither of us became someone else. Instead, we borrowed strengths from each other. Psychologists sometimes describe healthy growth as expansion rather than replacement. People do not necessarily become different individuals. They become larger versions of themselves by integrating new perspectives and skills. That description perfectly matches our journey. We remained different. But our differences became complementary rather than competitive. One afternoon not long ago, I experienced a moment that perfectly captured this transformation. Our family was gathered together. Nothing extraordinary was happening. No major celebration. No important milestone. Just an ordinary day. The children were talking. My husband was laughing. The atmosphere felt relaxed and warm. As I looked around the room, a memory suddenly returned. I remembered that rainy evening years earlier when we nearly gave up. I remembered the exhaustion, the frustration, the uncertainty. I remembered wondering whether our marriage would survive. And then I looked at the life we had built. Not a perfect life. A real life. A strong life. A meaningful life. The contrast was astonishing. That moment taught me something I hope every person watching this video remembers. A difficult season does not automatically predict a difficult future. People often assume that today's struggle defines tomorrow's outcome. Reality is rarely that simple. Growth takes time. Trust takes time. Understanding takes time. Many of the most important improvements in life happen gradually. Almost invisibly. Like a tree growing one day at a time. You rarely notice the change while it is happening. Years later, the difference becomes undeniable. Research supports this idea as well. Studies on resilience consistently show that people often underestimate their ability to adapt. Human beings are remarkably capable of learning, adjusting, and recovering from challenges. Relationships are no exception. Of course, not every marriage follows the same path. Every couple faces unique circumstances. Every family has its own story. Yet certain principles appear again and again. Listening matters. Respect matters. Patience matters. Gratitude matters. Curiosity matters. And perhaps most importantly, the willingness to keep learning matters. One of the greatest misconceptions about relationships is the belief that successful couples stop growing. The opposite is usually true. Strong relationships continue evolving. People continue learning. Challenges continue appearing. Growth continues happening. Even now, my husband and I still disagree sometimes. That fact might surprise viewers expecting a fairy tale ending. But real happiness does not require the absence of disagreement. It requires the presence of connection. That distinction changed my life. Today, when disagreements appear, they no longer feel like evidence that something is wrong. They feel like opportunities to understand each other more deeply. Not always enjoyable opportunities, but valuable ones. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson hidden inside this entire story. Love is not a reward given to perfect couples. Love is a skill developed through imperfect moments. A marriage survives not because two people avoid difficulties. A marriage survives because two people repeatedly choose each other while navigating those difficulties. When I look at my husband now, I do not see someone who finally became exactly like me. I see someone who remained himself. And I am grateful for that. Because if he had become exactly like me, I would have lost the person who helped me grow. The same is true for him. Our differences once felt like walls. Today they feel more like bridges. Bridges connecting perspectives. Bridges connecting experiences. Bridges connecting two lives that turned out to be stronger together than apart. And that is the answer to the question that began this journey. My husband and I survived because we stopped measuring success by agreement. We started measuring success by understanding. We stopped trying to win against each other. We started working alongside each other. We stopped asking, who is right? And we started asking, how can we move forward together? That simple change transformed everything. If you are learning English through this story, I hope you gained new words, new listening practice, and new confidence. If you are facing challenges in your own life, I hope you gained something even more valuable. A reminder that progress is possible. Growth is possible. And sometimes the chapter that feels like the ending is actually the beginning of a much better story. The strongest relationships are not built by people who never struggle. They are built by people who refuse to stop learning. That truth changed my marriage. And it may change more lives than we realize. Before you leave, think about this for a moment. What if the biggest challenge in your life right now is not the end of your story, but the beginning of a chapter you cannot see yet? Years ago, when my husband and I disagreed about almost everything, I thought our differences would eventually pull us apart. Instead, those differences became the very lessons that taught us how to build trust, patience, understanding, and a stronger family. The obstacles that once looked like walls became bridges. Maybe your journey is not about becoming perfect. Maybe your journey is about becoming stronger, one small step at a time. And maybe that is true for learning English too. You do not become fluent overnight. You improve through small daily actions. One story. One sentence. One new word. One listening session at a time. That is why stories matter. Stories help us learn language, understand people, and discover parts of ourselves we never noticed before. As you continue your English learning journey, ask yourself this question. If two people who disagreed about almost everything could build a happy life together, what challenge in your own life might be more possible than you think? The answer may surprise you. And the next story on this channel might help you find it. If you enjoyed this slow English story, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss future videos about learning English through stories, slow English listening practice, English speaking practice, American culture, love stories, marriage stories, and real-life English conversations. Leave a comment below and tell me, what was the most meaningful lesson from today's story? I read your comments, and your answer might inspire someone else around the world. Thank you for spending your time here today. Keep listening. Keep learning. Keep growing. And remember, sometimes the story that changes your English is the same story that changes your life. See you in the next story. Subscribe now and continue your English journey with us.